Hey everybody, it's Natalie McKenzie with The Whole Woman, and it's 6 o'clock here on the East Coast. That makes it Quaran-Tea time. That's right. Grab that tea, hit that share button, and get ready because today's guest is probably one of the most iconic we've had. And why would I say probably? We know that he is. I am honored, I am humbled, and I am delighted to share with you today's guest. He is the unrelenting civil rights fighter, none other than the Dr. Reverend Al Sharpton. Help me welcome. Hello, Reverend Sharpton.
Hi, how are you?
I am well, sir. If I may take the liberty, may we refer to you as Reverend Al?
Absolutely.
It is a delight to have you. I am honored. I am humbled. And if I trip over my tongue, I'm just having a star fan moment.
Uh,
How are you, sir?
I'm fine. I'm great. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am very well. I am delighted to have you and to share you with our audience in such an intimate setting. I just want to say to you, sir, we have your resume. You have your own Wikipedia page. So we know all about what you have done. You have lived your life in the public eye. And we're grateful for all that you have done. And you did not always have the approval of John Public or the general public, but you have always had the best interest of Black people at heart. And for that, we thank you.
Well, thank you. Very glad to be on your show. And you and Obi are close to me.
Thank you, sir. And I know Obi did a little twisting to get you to sit with us a little bit because we know your schedule is so demanding.
Yeah, but Obi, I would tell everybody, Obi, when he was one of the chief executives at Freedom National Bank, which was the only Black full service bank in New York, when I was growing up, Obi was my banker when I didn't have any money. How he pulled that off, I still don't know.
God works in mysterious ways, and
Absolutely.
we don't need to know the details. How's that?
Yeah. All right.
So, Reverend Al, we'd love to learn a little something about you. Please tell us about the young lad, Alfred Sharpton, that grew up to be this giant of a man that we see today. What went into the making of you, sir?
Well, I started and I am formed by the Black Church. When I was very young, my parents brought me to Washington Temple Church of God in Christ. I
Mm-hmm.
was baptized there when I was 3 years old, and I became a member of the Junior Usher Board. And that is for people that watch the show that don't know what Junior Usher Board. They're the ushers. That's the kids we hand out the program and help the older ushers seat people. And first year they said we're going to have a Junior Usher Board anniversary, and it was about 15, 20 of us. And we were in a meeting with the adult advisor, a lady named Hazel Griffin. And Miss Griffin asked us, what did we want to do on the program? And there was a young man there about 2, 3 years older than me, so he would have been 6 or 7. I was 4 at the time, and his name was Ronnie Dyson, who later became a Broadway star in the play Hair, and then an R&B singer. He said he wanted to read a poem, and my sister Joy said she wanted to sing. And it got to me, I said I wanted to preach. All the other kids started laughing. And Miss Griffin said, don't laugh, don't laugh. Maybe God is calling you. So she brought me to the bishop, Bishop Washington. And Bishop Washington said, let him preach. Let's see if God's calling him. And that July 9th of that year, 1959, I know the date, they put me on a box. It was about 900 people in the church. And I preached from St. John's 14th chapter, first verse, let not your heart be
Be
troubled.
troubled.
Believe also in me. My first sermon. By the time I was 7, I was like going around to all of the Black churches in Brooklyn as the Wonder Boy preacher. So I grew up in the church. And being in the church, my parents broke up when I was 10. And I started becoming enticed. I watched the news a lot. Because being a boy preacher, it was awkward to other kids because their parents would come hear me preach. So they didn't invite me to the ball games out, playing stickball in the street and all. So I would watch the news a lot. And I got enticed with Adam Clayton Powell. I watching him on the news. There was this black preacher, congressman, and I wanted to go to the rallies. And around 66 or so, I was 11 or 12, because my parents broke up, as I said, when I was 10. And my mother was scared me going to these rallies with what she called militants would get me out to church. And she brought me to Bishop Washington and said, I'm nervous. Alfred's going to all of this stuff, bugging me to go because I was too young to go on my own. And he said, I know what to do. And he brought me to Reverend William Jones, pastor at Bethany Baptist Church, who headed Operation Breadbasket in New York, which was Martin Luther King's New York chapter. And he said to Reverend Jones what my mother's dilemma was. And Reverend Jones said, I know what to do with him. He said, we'll make him our youth director because all of the young people in the churches know him from him being a boy preacher. He can bring young people in. So I started in the civil rights at 12. 13, I became the youth director. That year, Dr. King got killed. And Dr. Jones introduced me to another mentor. Jones was my mentor. And the other mentor that kind of took me under his wing with Dr. Jones was Jesse Jackson. And I literally grew up in the black church and in the movement.
Now, at what age were you ordained, Reverend Al?
10 years old. I was ordained. Bishop Washington took us to the Caribbean. We did 5 countries, and I preached at every one of them. And he ordained, he licensed me, which shifted into an ordination.
Wow, at 10 years old. Now, Reverend Al, in today's age, 2020, you'd have been called a prodigy kid.
Right, that's right. One of the reasons why later in life, I don't get to talk about it often, but why later in life, Michael Jackson and I got to be close is because we used to always talk about how neither one of us had a childhood. Because he grew up a prodigy, using the term you just referred to, singing, doing rehearsals and all. And I grew up preaching. So neither one of us did what so-called regular kids did. I grew up in the pulpit, he grew up on stage, so we would talk about it.
That is wonderful. Reverend Al, so your parents separate, you're growing up in the church, you have these iconic males as your mentors and, pseudo dads. What was it like growing up in a New York in that era, toggling civil rights and Christendom and trying to grow up? Because I'm sure the person you were at 10, you had a different view by 13. How did you manage all of that?
Well, it was natural to me. It's like sitting down at a laptop and the password and the lights, everything goes on. When I got involved in Operation Breadbasket and civil rights, the lights went on. And I just instinctively knew, which I feel was my calling, this was the kind of minister I wanted to be. I did not want to have a big church. I wanted to be involved in the movement, and I never left. And being that Jesse never passed, Bill Jones had a big church, Bethany. I said, I want to be like Jesse. I want to be an activist where I can minister around the country, around the world. And that's what I ended up doing later in life. But I modeled myself after those men because they became the fathers that I didn't have. Every young boy, that's why I believe in the mentorship programs that are in our communities. Every young boy is going to seek a male image or male images. Every young lady is going to do the same. And when you are wise, as my mother was, she's from Alabama, uneducated, but she was wise enough that if she put me around the right male models, that I wouldn't get in the street and do other things. Because you're going to find a male model somewhere, and it could have been a gang buster, it could have been somebody doing something wrong. By putting me that environment, your environment helps to create your worldview.
Absolutely. Now, you're thrusted in the middle of the civil rights movement. you're getting ready to graduate high school. How do you toggle the natural, usual activities of a teenage boy getting ready to do the prom and the whole? Did you bother with any of that?
It was a volatile time in New York, where when I went to high school, for example, uh, they had the teacher strike over community control of schools. Blacks
Hmm.
want to control their schools. And by the time I was a senior, we were still dealing with a lot of racial conflict. We actually boycotted the prom, and I called the boycott. I was the head of the African American Club, so I never went to the prom. And when we graduated, when I was a senior graduating high school, I remember the principal. His name was Joseph Shapiro. But when he called on stage, he was giving out the diploma. He got to me and he said, Alfred Sharpton, and he says, I've never been more happy to give a senior a diploma because I used to march on him. I did this all my life. So he was glad that I graduated.
So I have to say this as a disclaimer. I am Jamaican, and so I moved here in 1990 or 1991. And I came here and I knew all about you. I heard all about you because, the Jamaicans are very tapped into what's happening in racial justice and justice, so to speak, here in the US for many years. And Marcus Garvey is our hero. So I want to understand, how did you handle going to college and where did you go to college?
I
And
went to Brooklyn College.
were you still actively engaged in
Oh
civil?
yeah, very much so. 'Cause I was still in breadbasket. When I was 16, I started my own youth group, and we were fighting then whatever the racial issues were. An interesting story that most people don't know. When I told you when I was 10 and we went and did those five Caribbean countries, one of them was Jamaica.
Of course.
And I remember like it was yesterday. We did 5 nights that I preached at the Ward Theater in Kingston, Jamaica.
All right.
And because I was such a big fan of Adam Clayton Powell, I used to read all of the books on Powell, who I got to meet, and he knew me from being a boy preaching. Powell used to talk in his books and refer to in his sermons about Marcus Garvey. So I wanted to know about Marcus Garvey. Apparently, when Powell was younger, Garvey was in Harlem. His father, who was Pastor Abyssinian before him, was against Garvey because they would split in Black America on Garvey. And Adam Jr., my hero, loved Garvey. He'd sneak out to go to Garvey's parades and all, and it was all in the books. So I'm there at the Kingston Sheraton Hotel, and I'm thinking about I'm in the land of Garvey. So I pick up the phone. I'm 10 years old, and I called 411 or whatever the directory was, and I asked, do they have a listing for Amy Jacques Garvey, which was his widow? Because I remember reading a book on Garvey called Black Moses, and they said yes, and they gave me the number. I called her, and she answered the phone, and I told her I was a minister. I'm from New York, where they're doing a revival at the Ward Theater, and I read about Marcus Garvey. She said, really wonderful. Why don't you come have tea with me? So I went, I got a cab by myself, 10 years old, and went over to 12 Mona Road. That's where she lived. I remember this is how much is part of me. And I knocked on the door, and I could hear somebody come to the door, and then they went back and sat or wherever they were at. And I knocked again, and they came again. And finally, they were a little annoyed and opened the door. And I realized I was too short at 10
They
for
couldn't see you.
and she laughed. She says, "You're Minister Alfred Sharpton?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Come on in." And we sat and had tea, and she would ask me stuff about school and how did I know about Garvey, and I would ask her questions about Garvey. And she spent an hour with me. And when I was leaving, she says, "You're going to be a big leader." I says, "How do you say?" She says, "You have a big head like Garvey." And for several years, we were pen pals. I kept the letters. And years later, when I got to meet Dr. Julius Garvey, one of Garvey's son, and Marcus Jr., I told them the story. And the reason they knew I wasn't making it up, they said, 12 Mona Road, that's exactly where mother lived.
Oh, wow. What a beautiful story, Reverend Al. Thank you for sharing that with us. So, you start your own youth movement. Tell us a little bit about that youth movement and some of the things that you did.
We wanted to deal with the gap in education. We felt that we were not getting the same education people our ages were getting. There was some police brutality even then. There was a young man, 16, in Brownsville, Brooklyn, named Claude Reese that had been killed by police. I got involved in that. So it became a youth version of what Operation Breadbasket had done. By this time, Jesse had left Breadbasket and had formed Operation Push. I idolized Jesse. There was no push in New York, so I had my youth movement. And then when I was about 18, which is I started youth movement when I was 16, and the leadership in New York helped. Percy Sutton, who was then borough president of Manhattan, Clarence Jones was published in Amsterdam News. All of them like helped us raise funds. The lawyer that incorporated my youth movement when I was 16 was a young lawyer, young. He was older, much older than me, but he was young at that time. Named David Dinkins. Dinkins Incorporated, and he was the incorporating lawyer. And when I was 18, a young man came, joined our youth group, had just come up from Georgia, wanted to go to Columbia University Law School, Columbia Law School, named Terry, and same age as me. And after a month or so, he come around. We found out he was the son of Soul Brother number one, James Brown. And about 3, 4 months after that, Teddy got killed in a car accident.
Oh.
And James Brown came to New York, and he was in controversy then because he had endorsed Richard Nixon for president the year before, 72. This was 73. And Hank Spann, who was the biggest disc jockey in New York at the time, told him with Bob Law, who later became a big radio personality, but he was head of community affairs at the time. He says, if you want to do something for your son, in memory of your son, he was part of this youth group with this teenage preacher. And they introduced me to James Brown. James Brown did a concert in Brooklyn at the Albee Theater, which is now the Albee Mall, and took me under his wing. He liked me. I think because I was the same age as his son, and I replaced the son he had lost, and he became the father I didn't have. Because the only recreation I remember of my father was that he used to take us to the Apollo to see James Brown.
Oh, that's awesome, Reverend Al. You have such a colorful and rich history. And I think we get so caught up in the public image of who you are that we forget that you're a person and you've had these relationships, and these are some of the things that have shaped you. Now, Reverend Al, let's go into the 70s and 80s, early 80s. Tell us what you were doing at that time and how things were in New York and America by now, because by now we've had the Civil Rights Act passed. We think we're equal. We think we're supposed to get the same rights. But how are things going in the activist movement?
In New York, it was very divided, late 70s, early 80s, because we had a mayor at the time named Ed Koch. And when Ed Koch came in, he defunded a lot of programs. He called the anti-poverty programs, which was HARUAC in Harlem, Youth in Action in Brooklyn, Model Cities. He defunded a lot of them, calling them poverty pimps. So we would march on Ed Koch. We called him Bull Koch after Bull Connor down south. Because what people didn't understand is, as you correctly said, we had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but that was a lot of Southern-based stuff. New York and the North were institutional racism. So we could always sit in front of the bus. I never sat in the back of a bus or use a white water fountain, but you didn't get the same education and you couldn't get the same mortgages and you couldn't get the bank loans. And you were like in communities and knew you better not go to another community. And was the tension in New York. And my youth group, we would fight that. And as the 80s, early 80s, I remember Michael Jackson, who I knew because of James Brown, did this huge tour, the Victory Tour, in '84. And he asked me, we said we want blacks involved in the tour. And he asked me to head community affairs. So I did the tour, all 33 cities around the country. When I got back to New York around Christmas time, '84, a white man on a subway shot 4 kids saying they were trying to mug him, named Bernard Getz. And I started fighting, saying, why are y'all making him a hero? Because they made him a hero, said the vigilante. And I said, why are y'all making him a hero? So we picketed, we marched on his house. And that was like my first public acclaim, independent of breadbasket. And that was 84. Then after 84, we finally got gets prosecuted for the gun, not for the crime. And after that, the war on crack. Crack was inundating our community. And we knew that the police knew where the crack houses were because we knew. And I'm in my 20s now. And we used to paint where the crack houses was, red paint, market it. This is where it is. And in the middle of doing that, I get a call one day, about one night, in the middle of the night, about 86, from one of the guys who was on my youth movement staff by then. I had a small staff, 3 or 4 people. And his name was Derek Sunshine, he called. And Sunshine said, my cousin, my best friend, just got killed. Would you call his mother when you get up? And I thought it was a crack killing because we were painting crack out. So I got up, called his mother as a minister, gave my condolences. And she said, yeah, I saw you on TV painting crack houses. I asked what her address was. And I would come, pray with them. And I went to her house and I thought it was a crack killing. And it was Mrs. Griffith, the mother of Michael Griffith, who got killed in Howard Beach. And he was killed because they didn't allow blacks in Howard Beach at the time. And that's what shot up my civil rights career again. I led the marches out there, and the rest was history. I never looked back.
Wow. Reverend Al, here we are, 2020. I'm skipping a little bit because we have such a short time. And you are now renowned for the National Action Network, and everybody knows your phone's been blowing up. That's just you're getting calls left, right, and center. In the 90s, there was the issue with the boys who were charged for rape in New York City. I know you were very involved with that. That was really when I started paying attention to who you are rather. But to see that we've just had a rash of killings in late spring here in the US, how are you feeling about where we are as a country and what is happening in the US?
I feel that it's a challenging time. Uh, if you study history, it is always where you make a step forward and then there's a backlash. Uh, they had the Civil War, the abolitionist movement was to free the slaves. Lincoln didn't really want to free the slaves, but they convinced him he couldn't win the war unless he freed the slaves in the slave states. And they joined the Union Army and helped save the Union. Otherwise, Robert E. Lee would have been victorious and Stonewall Jackson or Jefferson Davis would have been the president. And they gave them rights then, Reconstruction. Then backlash came. Next president came, took all that back. Supreme Court took it back. So it's forward, backward, forward, backward. That's been the push and pull in the country. So you fast forward to what you asked about. Same thing happened in the 60s. Dr. King, the laws you referred to, backlash. Nixon comes in, Jimmy Carter a little bit after that, then you get Reagan, pushback. So as I knew the currents of history, I was very much supportive, very much involved with President Obama the 8 years he was in. But I knew there would be a backlash because that's the currents of history. The backlash was personified by Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the backlash to 8 years of a black president. And I think that he emboldened a lot of bias and bigotry of people that resented what Obama did, from affordable health care to police reform to other things. And that's where we are. And in the emboldened, I see these rash of violent incidents against us because people feel they can get away with it now. And George Floyd happened, Ahmaud Arbery happens 2 weeks later, and a week after that, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. All of this within a month while we're in a pandemic.
Yeah.
And people just exploded. The one great thing about it is you see more people involved, more people marching. I go to the marches. I preached to both of George's funerals, the one in Minneapolis and the one in Houston. And but you see, in many of the marches, as many whites as blacks, it's been an awakening. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the pandemic, people were locked in and all they would do is watch the TV. They couldn't watch sports. There was no sports. There was no distraction. So a lot of people that paid no real attention to the video of Eric Garner 6 years ago, saying I can't breathe on video, they were sitting there with nothing else to distract them, watching a man with his knee on this guy's neck. And they said, 8 minutes is not, that's brutal. And that caused the explosion. The key is in this moment, we've got to be able to change some laws and get something done because these moments don't last forever. And that's why we in National Action Network is doing what we can. We march on Washington in the end of August and other things, been in the rallies, because we need a policing law. It's passed the House already, the George Floyd Police Justice Act, and we need the Civil Rights Act passed. If we don't use this moment to turn the demonstrations into legislation, history will say we had the moment and we grew.
What year did you start National Action Network, sir?
1991.
Now, okay. So let me ask you this question, and I'm very mindful of time. I know we only have you for a limited time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. The young black men that were found guilty of that rape in Central Park, the Central Park Five, then years later we realized it came to light what you already knew, that they were not guilty. Tell me your role in that, and how did that affect you or impact you as a black male, as a father, and as an activist?
When they were arrested and indicted, and one of the mothers called me, because I had done Howard Beach by then, Yusuf Hawkins, and Bensonhurst, Tawana Brother. I did the cases, so I was well known. They called me and said they forced them confessions out of my son. I believed it because I knew they would do that. And I was attacked, castigated, cartoons and all, for standing up for these 5 rapists. And they were kids, they weren't rapists. Donald Trump, who was just a businessman then, put ads in the newspapers in New York saying they ought to be executed. And we went against all of that venom, standing for these young men. And they went to jail, served many years in jail. Finally, one day, a guy in jail was bragging to his cellmate. This is after they had done time in jail. And he told them guys didn't do that, I did it. The guy that was in the cell with him trying to use leverage to get out told the authorities. The authorities took him out and checked his DNA, and his DNA matched the DNA of the clothes that was there at the scene where this woman had been raped many years before. And that's what exonerated those 5. One of them got out named Corey Weiss, who served the most time because he was given time as an adult, even though he was a kid, but he was technically just over the age. And they had nowhere to work. And I told Corey Weiss, you work here at National Action Network. He worked for us for 3 years. And they finally gave all of them a big settlement for all them years in jail. But they couldn't give Corey back 13 years in jail for something he didn't do. Imagine sitting in a jail, call a rape for 13 years, and others did time too, and you know you didn't do it. And he worked with us, and even now we have rallies every Saturday morning in Harlem. Corey's there every Saturday because we were there for him. And I think you've got to, in life, if any advice I give people, you got to listen to that sound in your ear, that calling, and you've got to be prepared to take whatever adversity, whatever naysayers, because if you can get through the noise, you can get to where you can be successful. But if you allow the critics and the noisemakers to talk you out of your role, you will never achieve where you have to go.
I'm sensitive to time, sir. Normally we would ask about your family and talk about your wonderful family, but I'm going to skip over that because I think there's something a little more pressing right now that I want to ask about. This is an election year. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have the other pandemic that's happening parallel to this. The nation is in upheaval, and most households are going through their own personal economic depression. They're challenged on a health front and emotionally stressed because we're isolated, because we're quarantined. What do you have to say to us as an activist, a fighter for civil rights, and someone who is so adamant about getting everyone to get out and vote? How do we do all that in the middle of everything that's happening?
One is that we need to be clear what we want. What I've said to Biden and others is we need to have laws that economically empower us, where we take the banks and start building black banks, building these CDIs where we can invest and own our own communities. We need to take this moment to reevaluate since we're locked down because politics without economics is just a civil lesson. Second, we need to protect the right to vote because everything you're going to do is determined by some elected official. You can't even open up a business without the zoning board saying you can zone a business here. And we need to also teach our children our history. I tell young people that's in my organization and as I speak around the country that if you know Black history, we were captured and enslaved. We were brought across the Atlantic. Every time I go to Europe or Africa and fly back over the Atlantic, I think about the millions of our forefathers and foremothers at the bottom of that ocean. They survived storms, pandemics, all kind of sicknesses on that boat. Many didn't survive. Those were the ones they threw overboard, which means only the strongest of Africans made it
That's
to,
right.
to America and to the Caribbean, which means that we are in our blood the strongest of Africa. We can get past this pandemic because we've never been in nothing but storm. So we should not be weak now. It's in our blood, it's in our nature, it's in our DNA to overcome what others didn't overcome because we were the only ones in the history of the world that had this kind of slavery. There have been other slaves, but they were not only not brought over the perilous seas like we were. When we got here, they stripped us of everything. Our family sold daddy to one state, mama to another, the kids never to reassemble, took our names, we didn't know who we were, took everything about us, yet we survived. If we could come through all of that, then we can come through this because of who we are. We must know who we are, believe who we are, embrace who we are, and say we're strong enough to get through. I remember when I ran for president in 2004, they had a debate one night in Detroit. Never forget it. And I'm on the stage debating the other candidates, governors, senators. And when I came off the stage, a reporter stopped me from the Detroit Free Press. He said, Reverend Al, I said, yes, sir. He said, you did pretty good in that. I said, thank you. He said, I think you won the debate. I said, well, thank you. He says, you ought to be proud of yourself. And I stopped. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, you're up there debating governors and senators, and you don't come from that. You ought to be proud to be up there with them. I said, they ought to be proud to be up there with me. He looked at me, he says, what do you mean? I said, they were all born on third base and think they hit a triple. I wasn't even born in the ballpark. I had to come through the parking lot, down through the bleachers, down through the stands, and then hit a triple to get to third base. Yet we're all on the same stage. If they had to come through what I came through, they wouldn't be on that stage. So the fact that I'm on the stage that they were given and I had to earn means I'm at least smart as they are and stronger than they are.
There you go. You're a prodigy child. You're not anybody's regular kid. Reverend Al, you tell it like it is. Thank you for joining us. I have one more question for you because I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. Politics Nation on MSNBC. How many years have you had this show, sir?
Next year it'll be 9 years. No, I
Nine
mean
years.
next month in August will be 9 years.
Nine
I
years.
started end of August 2011.
Now, how about that, sir? Because the Reverend Al Sharpton that I first was introduced to in the early 90s, late 80s would have never been given a seat at that table. I
Right.
know you probably brought your own table to the room. Tell
I,
us how that came about.
I a black woman named Paula Walker Madison, who was an executive at NBC, said to me one day, why don't you go to the president of NBC, MSNBC, Phil Griffin, Tell him you want a show once a week. He's because your mentor Jesse Jackson used to have one on CNN called Both Sides. And I said, okay. I went pitched. He said, let me think about it. He said, I tell you what, Ed Schultz, who had a show at the time, is going out on vacation. Host his show 2 or 3 nights. And I said, all right. I went and hosted the show. I'm messing up the teleprompter because growing up a boy preacher, I never preached with a manuscript. So I wasn't used to reading anything and speaking. I'm used to just being extemporaneous. But the ratings stayed up. So after 3 days, he said, I tell you what, a guy's going out next week at 6 o'clock. Let's try that. So I went and did the 6 o'clock show for 2 or 3 days. And Phil Griffin called me that Thursday morning. He says, you getting comfortable with this? I said, yeah. I said, but I want to talk to you about the weekly show. He says, come by my office. I went by his office. He says, I don't like to do things already been done. So I sunk. I said, well, he's not going to do my weekly show. He said, how would you like to stay on every night at 6 o'clock? I said, huh? He said, the guy's not on vacation. That guy I terminated. It's your show. We'll do the contract while I do it. And Phil Griffin had the audacity. He was attacked, but he gave me that show, and I did 4 years, 5 nights a week. Now I do 2 days on the weekend. And he just did it based on his own talent and his own courage. And I'm still there. And most people last in TV 2 or 3 years. I'm doing 9 years now.
I can keep going, Reverend, but I'm very respectful of your time. Tell me about your greatest joy. I think I know what it is, but I would not dare to assume. What are your greatest joys?
My greatest joy right now is I have my first and only grandson, Marcus Al, seeing him grow up. I never thought, I was stabbed once leading a march, been to jail for protest. I never thought I'd live to see a grandchild. So I'm joyous about that. And I'm joyous when the families I fought for come around and say I gave them voice. In many ways, it's because I think I see my mother that raised me on welfare after daddy left. And nobody stood up for her. And I wanted to be the guy that would stand up for people that others wouldn't stand up for. And that's my greatest joy. Awards, honorary degrees, all that's nice. But when a mother that reminds me of mine said that you gave me voice, that's my greatest joy.
Reverend Al, you are a stand-up Black man. I am proud, honored, and delighted to know you. I am so excited that you could join us today. I would like to offer to you, sir, you certainly don't need us, but The Whole Woman is an international women's organization. We're multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. We're apolitical, but we believe in fighting for equal and adequate, appropriate education and healthcare for women and children. However, we can be partners to you over at National Action Network to help to mobilize the causes that you fight for. You call on us. We are so proud to have had you today, and I could keep talking to you for another 30 minutes.
I appreciate it, and I thank you, and God bless you and bless the whole women. And tell Obi, I'm not rich, but I don't bounce checks no more.
I certainly will. And since you mentioned Obi, I'll tell you what one of his sayings are. Sayings is, he says all the time, if I am standing here and looking a white man in the face, a CEO or some notable in the face, and I'm standing in the valley and he's on the mountaintop, I must be a giant. And so that's akin to your phrase. That's right.
That's right.
We are stronger than, taller than, and better than we think. The Reverend Al Sharpton, I am so honored to have you, sir. Delighted. Thank you for joining
us. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
To see you again. Good luck tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Natalie McKenzie, and you just had 39 minutes of the Reverend Al Sharpton, uncensored, unscripted, and raw. That is the man, the prodigy child that has grown up to be this honorable man, this giant of a man that is constantly fighting for civil rights and for the rights of mothers and their children. Join us on Monday because we have another exciting lineup for you. I am so overwhelmed right now. I can't even remember who our guest will be on Monday. So we'll tell you all about that. But in the meantime, I wish you enough life to live, enough joy to give, enough love to share. I wish you enough. And Monday's guest will be Michelin Davis. I'm Natalie McKenzie. Good night.